New Zealand offers quite a dramatic example of how a habitat has been transformed quite quickly from one type, which was an old growth, slow growing rainforest, to a high intensity grazing system over a short duration of time. So over 100 to 150 years, a lot of lowlands environments in New Zealand have transformed from that forest to that intensive style of agricultural pasture-based farming. So there's been quite a big impact on the environment in association with that, but you can also see how the changes in the ecosystem result in changes of fertility and production as well. So you've gone from a stable old growth forest, which is sustainable in its production, so there's all these resources that can be drawn out of that ecosystem. It doesn't pollute the environment. It's in balance with its climate and its topography and all the characteristics of that site. And you've taken that balanced, productive system, which is very productive as far as the timber and the production of birds and the fertility of that system and the recycling of nutrients in that system. It's all a very highly productive system, and we've transformed that into a system that is very polluting to the environment, requires a high input of resources to maintain it, and as a result of that high input also results in a high pollution of the environment as those inputs flow through the production system straight into the environment. So it's of interest to kind of look at how that old growth forest functioned, and then see what are some of the impacts associated with the transformation of that into our pasture-based farming. So when we look at our old growth forest, it's quite a slow growing forest. They're dominated by quite ancient species of protocarp trees, which are kind of slow growing evergreen trees that result in an ecosystem that's is quite unique. So coupled with the temperate climate and the high rainfall, it's resulted in quite a big thick leaf litter from all these plants dropping their leaves and getting broken down. Quite a rich productive topsoil, which you don't tend to get in more tropical, highly productive, faster growing forests, because all of that nutrients from the topsoil are being extracted by the trees and put into their production. So in comparison with our slower growing trees, with all that input of organic matter into them, and also the input of nutrients from all of the birds, so you're getting all the seabirds coming to New Zealand as well as all the land-based birds, and all the fertility of their input of manures into the soil. It results in quite a rich, productive topsoil within that forested system. And then another characteristic of an old slow-growing forest is a deep subsoil, which you do get in New Zealand as well. And with our particular climate and weathering, it's often quite a clay-based subsoil that you get in New Zealand. So when you take that habitat and you cut down the trees and you burn them all off, you are removing the elements in that system that are recycling that organic matter and protecting the soil from erosion. So by removing them, there's no longer a stable input of fertility into that system from the trees and the leaf litter and the associated plants. And also that loss of habitat results in a loss of all the bird species that were also inputting their fertility into the system. So there's been a massive decline in input of fertility and carbon and other organic matter into that system. And with that soil now being exposed, it will then erode away very quickly as it's exposed to weathering from wind and rain. But initially when this was done, because the topsoil was quite rich and fertile, and we cut down all those trees and we burnt them all down, and there was this big input of potash into the system, it was a very fertile, productive system initially. So the early settlers into New Zealand were quite amazed because they've come from environments where for 10 to 50,000 years of human occupation have degraded that environment to a point which they just take for granted as being quite low in productivity. They've come from that environment to New Zealand, where it's just a very newly transformed environment. So all the fertility of that old growth forest they could draw upon all that richness and fertility to prop up their production. So initially it was like boom period of agricultural production in New Zealand, and as well as being very productive, there was good markets as well. So they could export it back to Europe and England because there was a big demand in those countries for the products from New Zealand. And then following on the back of that, over the war years, there was a sustained market for the production of agricultural resources from New Zealand. But towards the end of the war years, coming up to 80 to 100 years of agricultural production in New Zealand, things were starting to taper off quite a lot. We'd lost a lot of our topsoil because it had washed away. That initial fertility in the soil had been used up in our production, and there wasn't the systems within those farms to renew the organic matter and to replenish the organic matter within the soil, or to build up the soil life in the soil. So over time, those soil communities were being impoverished and diminished and degraded to a point where their production was less productive. But towards the end of the war years, we actually found that we could use a superphosphate artificial fertilizer to boost up that production again. So we went to a period of diminishing return to a dramatic increase in production again, propped up by those artificial fertilizers. But the problem was that just the addition of those fertilizers doesn't address all the problems of a degraded, toxified soil, and not only was that soil degraded, but now there was this input of all these chemicals into that soil too, which further compromised and killed off the soil life that was in it. So there was a continuous decline, even with the input of fertilizers, to the quality and the quantity of the soil. And a lot of steeper areas of agricultural production in New Zealand now, the areas are so degraded from erosion and chemical intoxication and overgrazing that we can no longer support any meaningful agricultural production on those lands because they're being degraded so severely. And our management of our lowland productive systems is being supported by such a high input of nutrients and fertilizers and chemicals that there's been a dramatic pollution and toxifying of our natural environments, and increasingly we're no longer willing to accept that toxicity of the natural environment as a consequence of boosting up our agricultural production of all these chemicals. So we're having to move away in both of those environments, the hill country and the lowland environments of New Zealand, and change the way we design and manage those systems in a way that looks after the soil and preserves the agricultural production into the long term, and also doesn't pollute our environment. And in addition to that, the overseas markets that we're exporting to are increasingly demanding that there's a good story behind the agricultural production. They want to see that farmers are considering organic principles and philosophies in their production, that the farms are sustainable and regenerative and don't pollute or impact the environment negatively. So we're increasingly having to think about how we can redesign our systems to be more in alignment with preserving our environments and preserving their long-term productivity. And the way we're doing that currently and for the last 50 years has been to look at increasing advancements in technology and looking at technology as being the saviour to maintaining our level of agricultural production, and just supporting it with more and more clever technologies to maintain the way we do our agricultural production. But increasingly we're realising that we're getting the same negative impacts even with improvements and changes in technology, and we're not getting a regeneration and a restoration of the health of those agricultural systems. And the whole theme of this course is really looking at how we can better align the agricultural production with the health of those systems, and try to make more beneficial connections between the biological elements of the farm to replicate the healthy function of an ecosystem. So Some of the impacts of farming in New Zealand have been like the high levels of erosion, particularly on the hill country of New Zealand, because there's no longer those forests to protect them. They're being compacted and overgrazed, and the mechanical wearing of those hooves of those animals quite severely impacts the erosion of those environments. And without any forest to protect them from the rain and the wind have quite an erosive impact in themselves to remove the topsoil, and there's nothing other than a very short swath of grass to hold that soil together. The extreme loss of habitat, so New Zealand's got the most highly modified lowland environments of the world. We've lost, depending on what particular environment you look at, somewhere between 90 to 97% of all of our lowland rainforest and wetland has been removed and degraded and changed into intensive agricultural production. So it's a very highly modified environment, and an environment that results in a lot of chemical pollution of the environment, because it's being supported by such a high input of fertilizers and is managed at such an intensive level. The compaction of soil, so the compaction of soil is really twofold. Really, it's not being the soil not being supported by such a big root zone and a diversity of plant species that help aerate and create a habitat to loosen up that soil and provide a habitat for all the soil organisms to infiltrate into that soil and create air gaps in that soil. So the changing of that habitat to just grass results in a smaller root system and a loss of all that structure and complexity in that soil. And then on top of that, the compaction of the livestock further impounds the compaction of that soil. And as the soil becomes impacted, there's less opportunity for soil life to colonize that soil, so you get a loss of habitat for the soil life. It doesn't allow water to soak into that soil, so nutrients also don't soak into that soil, they tend to wash off the surface. And in winter, particularly with a clay subsoil, they get wet and boggy very easily, so they turn to mud, and the mud erodes away in winter into the water that runs across those farm systems as well. And with the changing of the dynamics of water in that system, you also get a drying up of springs and a lowering of the water table. So no longer can water percolate and infiltrate into the soil, it just runs across the surface. So all the springs dry up, the water table drops down, and that further dries up the soil and further reduces the opportunity for life to colonize that soil, makes it harder for trees to become established, and generally just degrades that whole habitat. It moves it closer towards the desert. Loss of organic matter, so you no longer have all the trees and plants and all the associating birds and all the other creatures in that ecosystem recycling all that organic matter as a healthy ecosystem does. It's become an unhealthy, dysfunctional system which doesn't recycle organic matter anymore. So over time, as it's continually producing a crop of grass or other plants, you're getting a continuous decline and loss in organic matter. And also you're getting like this big change in the habitat. So and no longer was it these very adaptive species that are native to that environment. They've been replaced by quite genetically exotic introduced species of low genetic diversity have been introduced into that system. And when you do that, when you kind of integrate exotic species that are not well adapted or come from similar environments that work well together, and their genetic diversity is low, so they're less able to change in response to changes in their environment, you get quite a different state of health of that environment, and that whole system doesn't work like it used to. So it's really a culmination of all these factors that has led to the position we're at now in our agricultural production, and it really paints the picture of informing us as agricultural designers and producers of what we need to do to fix those systems, to restore them to health and increase their productivity to sustainable long-term levels, that this land becomes an asset for future generations and doesn't impact upon the health of natural systems, and actually restores and extends those natural systems to make them a bigger part of our agricultural landscapes and part of our lives as we inhabit those landscapes.